Although, yes, it says here the webinar has started. Happy Friday, everybody. Welcome to a very steamy July in most places. In some places, not as much. Please do let us know when you're rolling in here in the chat if you're joining us on Zoom, where you're hailing in from. And for any of you that have been affected by Beryl, we're sending you prayers. We hope that you have remained safe. We understand that the power has been a real issue in many places with the heat. So we're sending you all of our love and hoping that you are safe, that your loved ones are safe, and that you are staying cool as much as possible. Once Jason enables the chat, we'll look forward to seeing where you guys are all hailing in on. And for those of you joining us on social media, welcome. I'm so excited to be hosting Chi's monthly webinar. My name is Dr. Shamini Jan. I'm the founder and CEO of the beautiful nonprofit collaborative, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. We bring together scientists, leading thinkers, practitioners, educators, and artists to bring together facets and streams of wisdom on healing so that we can all collectively benefit. It's our pleasure to be hosting these free Friday webinars every month. You can access this totally free. I'm going to answer a question that typically gets asked, which is, will I have access to this later? Yes, you will. We allow these to be freely distributed for the next 48 hours so you can watch it all weekend, send to a friend, because I know you'll be inspired by the conversation as I will be today. For those of you who join us as Chi contributors, thank you very much. Your support, just like PBS, here we affectionately call Chi the PBS of healing and consciousness and healing. Your support at a mere $9 a month helps us keep these webinars going, support the staff in order for us to keep these going more freely for the public during the weekend. If you are interested in deepening your flow and deepening your knowledge base in these areas, when you join us as a Chi contributor, and Jason will put a link into the chat on how to do that, it's very simple. Your tax-deductible donation of $108 a year helps us keep these going, of course, and allows you to access all of these webinars, including this one, in perpetuity. And we have so many amazing teachers, wisdom, research, and practice that are shared in these webinars. So if you haven't joined us as a Chi contributor, I do hope you will consider doing so. And we've got Lake Tahoe, we've got Poland, we've got Durham, we've got Colorado, more Colorado, Toronto, Hungary, Charlottesville, Virginia, El Cajon, California, Oklahoma, Flagstaff, a lot of US folks today. We typically have a lot of people joining internationally as well. Trinidad, Ireland. Wow, thank you all for coming together. So fun for us to get together in real time. And without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today, one of my most favorite scientists. Neil, I don't remember exactly when it was that we met, but I know we've known each other for a long time. It might have been at a science and non-duality meeting, or it was
or in San Diego. Chi was at it could be at lots of places.
Well, really,
Sages and scientists, maybe. Yeah.
Yes, sages and scientists too. I know you met when we just begun the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, and those discussions with you back 10 so years ago were always so enlightening, and I'm just absolutely thrilled that you've chosen to join us to talk about one of your many loves, which is complexity. And I'm just going to give a little bit of a formal introduction to you for those who have not met Neil yet. Dr. Neil Theise is a professor of pathology at the NYU Grossman Center School of Medicine. Through Neil's scientific research, he's been a pioneer of many things, including adult stem cell plasticity and the anatomy of the human interstitium. I know many of you who are interested in this area have heard about the big breakthroughs that came through with the human interstitium, the body-wide fluid matrix. Perhaps we'll touch on that today as we touch on other things. But Dr. Theise's studies in complexity theory have also, in addition to his work on the interstitium, have led to interdisciplinary collaborations in fields including integrative medicine, consciousness studies, and science-religion dialogue. His recent book, which Neil is going to hold up for us because I forgot to bring my copy with me to the office here, his recent book, Notes on Complexity, a scientific theory of connection, consciousness, and being, presents the fundamentals of complexity theory and insights gained from his studies to a general audience. That is to say that it is absolutely accessible to all. And I just love this
It's
book.
thin
It's
and
been
has pictures.
it's easy to read, actually. It's just brilliantly written. It's been awarded a 2024 Nautilus Book Award Gold Medal in the category of science and cosmology. And Neil, I gave this book to my daughter who was 18 and going into
Oh, that excites
fashion
me.
design at Parsons because she thinks in this way, even though she didn't have language for it. And I said, just look at, she said, what is this about? And I said, you've just got to read it. It's going to absolutely make sense. It resonates with everything you want to do. And she read it and she loves it. She absolutely loves it. It makes so much sense. So I'm so grateful for teachers like you. You're a professor, you're a scientist, you've done deep, deep research into this field, and you make this accessible to all of us. And it's so important in our day and age. It's part of what we love at Chi is having leading teachers and thinkers like you help us understand things that we may think that are above us, and they're really not. So thank you for being.
You know, people, that's not uncommon that people say that sort of thing to me. And I'm like, I had to make it simple enough for me to understand. Um, and, with the right patience and approach and really good teachers, and I've been very lucky to find really good teachers, there's nothing you can't teach, to fifth graders. Actually, it's funny that reminds me. It's off topic, but that's my method. When I was in third grade at Annie Fisher School in Hartford, Connecticut, my teacher, Mrs. Bean, made a statement at the Connecticut Teachers Association that there was nothing you couldn't teach to a third grader. And someone said, you can't teach them banking and economics. And so, and we didn't know that that's what happened. We just suddenly discovered that we were learning about banking and economics, and we made construction paper cutouts for banks and bank vaults, and we all had bank accounts, and we had a bake sale, and so we had real money to move around and stuff. And at the end of the semester, four of us were piled up into a car with our parents and went, and we didn't know what we were going to. And it was a press thing for the Connecticut Teachers Association where people were going to ask us about banking and economics. And we did very well. And Mrs. Bean was a genius teacher. And maybe that's where I learned to do this.
Well,
So,
thank you, Mrs. Bean, for
yeah,
that
yeah.
inspiration because she raised a great soul and a great teacher. So thank you for this. Help us then understand why complexity theory is really the language of the day when it comes to science and medicine. I often, when I'm reading your book, I think about this. It's really a whole new way of it. It's not even new, as you know, but
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
whole way of explaining things that, if not undoes some of the way that we think, certainly expands our way of thinking into
Mhm.
something that
Yeah,
actually feels more consistent with the data we're seeing. So
right, right.
I know you have some slides you want to share. You're going to give us a little bit of an overview. We're going to have
Yeah.
time for questions. Those of you joining us on Zoom, we will have time for questions. So even as Neil is going through his presentation with us, just a nice overview of complexity theory and its relevance to healing work and consciousness, you will see in the bottom of your Zoom screen a Q&A box. So for those of you joining us live, it is your chance to pop in a question for Neil, and we'll touch base on those questions later during the hour.
So I wandered into complexity because I had been doing stem cell research. And a friend of mine in the UK, Peter Ride, was at the University of Westminster, and he had a friend named Jane Prophet, who was an artist. And he just wanted us to meet. And somehow we were never in the same city at the same time. So he got a grant from the Wellcome Trust. Um, I tell this story at the beginning of the book. And for interdisciplinary conversation. And we didn't have to have a project. We didn't have to have a report. We simply had to hang out in each other's cities with him recording Jane's and my conversations to see how a scientist and an artist would talk to each other. And I was explaining to her what we were finding in stem cells. This is back around 2000. And how cells from the bone marrow leave the bone marrow, go into other parts of the body, cells from those parts of the body return to the bone marrow or go elsewhere. And when I was describing this, she said, that reminds me of how complexity theorists talk about ants forming ant colonies. And I was like, what's complexity theory? And so she taught me. And what I now understand is that, yeah, first, as you said, complexity isn't that new. It really arose in the 1970s, which now we're old enough for that to be a while ago. I really think of it as one of the three great scientific theories of the 20th century. The first two, obviously, being quantum mechanics, and the other being relativity. And quantum mechanics describes the infinitesimal, and shows us things we couldn't possibly have imagined, and does it in a really coherent, mathematically rigorous kind of way that's kind of inescapable. Relativity talks about the big scale, and also shows us things that are completely counterintuitive, and yet we know that they're true, and we can send satellites out there and get them to where they're going because this works, and we have the Webb telescope, etc. But the world we live in of the day to day, where living things happen, that's what complexity theory covers. And it covers that from the quantum scale all the way up to the scale of the solar systems, galaxies, the universe. And that doesn't show us things that are counterintuitive. It actually shows us things that, like you said, I mean, when kids encounter this material, there's no resistance to it. When I do it for fifth graders, they're like, oh, yeah, I see this all the time. And if adults have some resistance, it's usually because they're too busy to pay attention and they've forgotten to look about what's happening. So complexity describes life. It describes how life arises in the universe, how small scale living things like cells self-organize into organs, which organize into bodies, and how bodies will organize themselves into social structures. Depending on what bodies you're talking about, it's an ant colony, flocks of birds, cities, the neighborhoods in cities, economies, ecosystems. And the same rules apply across all those scales. And that's what makes it in part really simple. And in the details, some really astonishing stuff comes out that goes way beyond just the scientific. And I think that's probably part of what you want to talk about, and certainly something I enjoy talking about. So shall I just leap into the little bit of a slide thing?
Sure. Sounds
Okay.
great. And I just have to say, I love that you learned about complexity theory from an artist.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so do I. And I wish I had time to go into her work and why she knew about complexity theory. She's worth Googling. Jane Prophet, Prophet,
Hmm.
specifically her project Technosphere. It will blow your mind.
Wow.
Um, Hi, Jane, if she's out there. But meanwhile, so this is the title of the book, and it's basically there are two large scale pieces to the book. Um, there's the book. um,
Now, Neil,
the,
you're part of it is, oh, I see. It was my issue. Sorry, I can see it perfectly. Thank you.
okay, cool. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and that's the bulk of, I think, what we're going to talk about today, is complexity and what I refer to as complementarity, and this concept that I think is very important for Chi and the kind of audience that probably you're speaking to, what I refer to as the boundless body. And then after that, we'll touch on consciousness and see how much it's worth unpacking that. It's the second half of the book, so it's a lot. But we'll see where we go. So to start, just the basics of complexity theory. Complex systems are defined as groups of interacting individuals that, if their interactions follow four simple rules, they organize themselves from the bottom up into larger scale structures, which seem planned from the top downward, but are not. These structures are described as emergent self-organization, or simply as emergence. And there's complexity, and then the other hallmark term of complexity theory is emergence, or emergent self-organization. And the thing about these structures is that they are creative and adaptive. And this is how they describe living things, which by definition, one definition of life is things in the universe that are creative and adaptive. So examples, like I said, all sorts of things. Complexity has been applied to the rise and fall of economic markets, urban development, as I mentioned, if people are familiar with the work of Jane Jacobs. way before complexity theory was out there, she was intuiting how people self-organize themselves into neighborhoods. And her book, The Life and Death of the Great Cities, is all about complexity theory. I got into it, as I said, talking about stem cells and tissue development and regeneration. And in particular, before my generation of stem cell biologists, we thought that cells in an embryo, becoming a fetus, becoming an adult organism, or cells from the bone marrow, let's say, becoming all the different cells of the bone marrow, always went in one direction, hierarchical, unidirectional. And then in my crowd, about 25 years ago, we started showing that things could jump in different directions that were unexpected. This is Dolly being cloned, for example. The work I did is like bone marrow cells becoming liver or heart or kidney or brain. And that's what Jane was referring to, and you'll see why. Beatlemania is my favorite example, because if you think the Beatles were the greatest band who ever lived, then you think they were responsible for all their creativity. But if you listen to all 10 hours of the Beatles anthology of the BBC interviews with the Beatles, over and over, they talk about how their creativity was driven in response to their fan base. The most famous example being Sgt. Pepper. It got to the point where the screaming girls in the stadiums of their concerts were so loud they literally could not hear themselves play. All they could do was feel for Ringo laying down a beat that they could feel in their feet on the stage to keep them in line. And so they got tired of doing that. And so because of the screaming girls, they wound up saying, we're going to do an album that can't be toured. And that's how they came up with Sgt. Pepper. Rise and fall of civilizations, evolution and speciation, and ant colonies, as I mentioned, are a classic example. I don't think I have time today to use ants to explain all these things, but we'll see. One of the things I like about using ants is that, as Jane did with me, there isn't anyone who didn't grow up amazed at ants anywhere in the world, because ants are everywhere. And whenever I start talking about ants, the audience starts to relax. It's very useful. So these 4 rules that I mentioned that determine whether things can interact and organize into emergent, larger scale, creative and adaptive structures are really simple. The first thing is numbers matter. 3 or 5 ants don't make a colony, 25 ants do. If you buy a colony of an ant farm and have it sent to your home, you'll see that they dig tunnels, they put dead ants in a cemetery, they create food lines, but as they die off, around 5 to 3 ants, they stop interacting with each other and there's no self-organization. So you need a certain number to self-organize. And the more you have, the more creativity, the more complexity you have. So 250 ants is not as dynamic a colony as 250, is not as dynamic as 25,000. And in human terms, a village is not a city, is not a megalopolis. But the same principles apply. It doesn't matter what scale you're talking about. Negative feedback loops prevail. This is negative, not as in bad, negative as in homeostasis. So air conditioner, temperature of a room goes up, air conditioner turns on, temperature cools down, air conditioner turns off. That's a negative feedback loop. And it keeps things in a nice oscillating range. And that's the nature of living systems. They oscillate in a comfortable, homeostatic, healthy domain. And I think a lot of what you're trying to do when you conceptualize things in terms of chi is what are the practices that actually help cultivate a body that can keep itself in homeostasis or return it to homeostasis if things get out of bounds because you're stressed or infected or whatever. You can have positive feedback loops. Think about, and a positive feedback loop would be like a room in which the heater turns on, and the hotter the room gets, the higher the heater turns on. Now, we have that in living systems. If we get a fever, that's a positive feedback loop. But then inevitably, once the fever has gotten high enough and enabled the immune system to get rid of the infection, then negative feedback loops come back in and squelch the positive feedback loops and return you to homeostasis. So positive feedback loops can exist, but there has to be an overall balance of the negative feedback. Now, you can get self-organization with positive feedback, and this is an important point. But it tends, instead of being creative and adaptive, it tends to be energy expending and self-limited. So think about, I'm going to move my face over here. You can't see my face on my screen projecting, can you?
I can.
You this little face?
It's like your face?
Yeah, is it in the middle of the screen with your face?
Yes. I
Oh,
think so.
so
I
I'll
mean,
put me to the side and just pretend I'm not there. Okay, so um, I still don't understand the 21st century. So, um, so the um, so how do you get self-organization that's energy expending and self-limiting? Think tornadoes, hurricanes, cancers, economic bubbles. So the negative feedback is really a key part of keeping a healthy system. Interactions are local without global sensing. There's no ant in the colony worrying about where the next food source is going to come from, or where the cemetery should be, or is there enough food, or is there a neighboring colony? It's just how ants interact with each other at the local basis. And so there's generally no top-down planning. It's a bottom-up phenomenon. Now, there can be top-down planning, but in fact, that's just, humans tend to think of things in a hierarchy. But when we talk about top-down planning and a hierarchy, what we're really talking about is that some elements of the network are connected to more elements of the network. Not that it's top-down, but there's just more interactivity. So the real basic thing here is that there's no global sensing. There's no one monitoring how things are happening at the whole. There may be the illusion of that in human societies, but we're always wrong.
Hmm.
And then the most important thing to me is there's this low level randomness in the system, this low level of unpredictability. And this is what Jane was really pointing out to me. So when you look at a food line of ants, it looks like a straight line going from the colony to the food source back to the colony. But when you look down more closely, you see there's always a few ants that aren't following the line. I have to do something with your face. I need to see you. Then I feel like I'm seeing somebody. Okay. Um, so, um, so it's like 3 to 4% of the ants. And it turns out that these are the ants, while all the other ants are following the line and getting that sugar cube back to the colony, it's these ants that are most likely to be out there finding a new food source even before the first food source runs out. Or if you step your foot in the middle of the line, it's these divergent ants that establish the most rapid, efficient route around your foot. So if there's no randomness in the system, then you don't get any self-organization. It's just complete disorder. But if there's too little, what did I say? If everything's random, that's what happens. If there's too little randomness, then if the environment changes, there's no option to change the organization to adapt to the changing environment. And so you have a rigid machine-like system. And one other thing we can say about living things is we're not machines, even though the dominant metaphor in our culture is that bodies are machines. We have molecular motors, cells are building blocks, we engineer tissues, but that's all bullshit. Living things are living things. They're not machines. And so you need this low-level randomness. An implication of this low-level randomness is that Stuart Kauffman's one of the founders of complexity theory and a really good friend and teacher of mine. And he termed this the adjacent possibles. In every moment, there's an array of possibilities for what the next moment will be in a complex system. It's not an infinite array because there's only a limited amount of randomness in the system. There's a limited array, but we can't predict just what the extent of that array is. And in the next moment, one of those adjacent possibles to this moment becomes the next moment, and a new cloud of adjacent possibles arises. So what this means is that living things, complex systems, the universe, are not machines. Newtonian mechanics and the universe working like a clock, it doesn't work that way. It's always inherently unpredictable, but it's not infinitely unpredictable and random. It's always tending towards adaptation and creativity. And it's changing in every moment. The universe is change. Shocking, right? And this is what Jane suggested as the comparison. When we were discovering that stem cells at a low level were doing other things, we were saying those actually were key to how a body would respond to injury and repair itself. And she said, that's just like the random ants. And this immediately brings up a couple of implications. If we talk about cells, the way Jane was pointing to, as members of a complex system, this has implications. First is, sounds scary, but it's real, the inevitability of mass extinction events. Another way of thinking about complexity theory is that it describes order in the universe. And the major forms of order that we understand, there's perfect order that's predictable, machine-like, billiard balls bumping into each other. Complete disorder, randomness, molecules in a gas. And then chaotic systems governed by fractal mathematics. And if you've seen fractals, everyone here is probably familiar with what fractals look like. What it turned out is that living systems, complex systems, mathematically exist at the edge of chaos, where order meets chaos, is as though chaos and order are sort of tugging at each other. And between that tugging, you get this information-rich zone, which is where life happens, where complexity arises. So you might think that you could take any complex system, if you understood it mathematically, and figure out which point in the system you could place it at. But because of that low-level randomness in the system, it actually wanders around in that zone. And given enough time, inevitably, it will stumble out of that zone, either into rigid order or total chaos. And then you have a mass extinction event, either a partial one or a complete one. And so the price of adaptation, of being alive, of being able to change and adapt to a changing environment, necessarily implies you're going to die. Some part of you is going to die, or inevitably the entire thing is going to die. There's no such thing as a fountain of youth. There's no such thing as eternal life. What you have is inevitable change and adaptation. And the thing that makes that possible is the possibility that there will be extinction events. And there's certainly a lot to unpack there. But all of a sudden, mathematical complexity starts sounding awfully metaphysical, right? Mm-hmm. And it'll get more so.
Neil, if we might, before we move on,
sure.
I would just love you to clarify a little bit more about that distinguishing characteristic between what we consider chaos and complexity, because, you know, I remember reading this in your book and rereading it a few times to just sort of let it really sink in. I heard you say, and this isn't just poetic language here, but that complexity really lies in that boundary, the edge of chaos, as you like to describe it, and I know as a term, it's the edge of chaos and order. So where there is more information, now we'll hopefully get to talking about how this might relate to the healing experience and the field and like this. You know, I know that much of it is just poetic speculation, perhaps, but this seems really relevant. This is a very, would it be appropriate to say this is a very high energy state?
It's a high informational state. Does that, and I'm now having to investigate information theory. It's like, okay, here we go. While writing my book, I was thinking, oh my God, I could add in another 40 pages on information theory to expand this out. There's a relationship between information as a thing in the universe. It isn't just a poetic term that we use to describe stuff we know. There's actually, it's now understood that you can quantify the amount of energy with the amount of information within a system, and that's related to the amount of energy in a system. Those are mathematical relationships I don't know very much about yet, but I'm working on it. The key thing is that David Packard, who coined the phrase the edge of chaos, the complexity arises at the edge of chaos. It's a famous phrase. He was interested in how this plays out in terms of evolution. And that in order for a living thing to exist in the world and survive and adapt, it has to be able to take in information from the world, process it internally, and then express a response back into the world. And so very simple things detect things in very simple ways. Bacteria will detect sugar gradients and pH gradients in the water they're swimming through. people will read the newspaper or go on the internet and they'll run screaming from whatever is facing us this fall. But the same thing is happening. You are receiving information from the world and processing it internally and expressing it. That's what drives creativity and adaptation and leads to greater complexity, which leads to greater capacities for picking up information from the world. So a bacterium can survive, can find its food worrying about pH and sugar gradients, but it's not going to be able to avoid the pool boy who's going to be putting antibiotic stuff in the pool to make sure you don't get an infection when you go swimming in your swimming pool, which people in San Diego can do, but not so much in New York. But people know how to sense that complexity. So that's another way, I think, is that helpful of understanding what's going on in that region. But mathematically, it's always right there. It's this very narrow realm. And the story of how that was discovered, that's, I think, chapter 2 or 3 in the book, is a phenomenal story to me of one man's scientific imagination, which is its own form of complexity. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good.
So it's always there. It's information rich.
And it's information rich, meaning it's information processing. There's always gathering information, processing it internally in a complex way, not like a machine. Intuitions are important. It's not just plugging the information into equations, which then pop out an answer. Bacteria move around in a much more free-flowing way, even though the information and the processing is incredibly simple. But you watch bacteria streaming in water, and you just know, you want to say, oh, they're swimming someplace. They've got a place to go. That's not entirely wrong. And then you look at people. But you look at people, we're thinking about the complexities of our own little lives. But if you are up in a skyscraper overlooking New York City, and you look down at the sidewalks and you see people moving up and down the sidewalks, lost in their own little worlds, listening to they've got their earpods in. I was in a garden in Kyoto a number of years ago. I had a day off and I was sitting in this garden, and there was a wisteria branch, and there were ants going up 2 lines on either side of the wisteria branch, and another line of ants coming down. And so I spent a lot of time looking at that. And then I got home and I got out of the subway at Essex and Delancey, which happens to be an unusually wide staircase for the New York City subway system. And it was rush hour. And there were 2 lines of people going up the sides and 1 line of people coming down the middle. Ants, people, we think we're special. Not so much. Shall I go on to the next bit?
It's you see the patterns everywhere. Yes, thank you for all that. And just a quick note too, as I remember reading in the book, and what you referred to in those 4 aspects of complex systems is that a big distinguishing factor too is often we think of chaos as unpredictable, but actually it's complexity that's unpredictable, and chaos is predictable mathematically speaking. Correct.
So it's the fabled butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil will create a tornado in Texas. That's the original one. That's the thing about chaotic systems. If the starting conditions are exactly the same, it is predictably going to turn out to be exactly the same thing. Even though it seems complicated and chaotic, it will always do exactly the same thing.
Actually, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, but complex systems, because of the little bit of the array of adjacent possibles coming from that randomness, you can't ever predict what's going to go. And that's the magic of life and existence and the living universe, right?
Beautiful, yes.
Now, the thing that's implicit in what I've already said, but now I'm going to make it explicit, and this was a big moment for me when I sort of took this in. If you're walking along the desert and you see a dark thing on the desert floor, you think, what's that thing over there? And maybe you see it changing shape a little bit, but you think it's a thing. And then you go up closer to it and you realize it's not a thing, it's a process, it's a phenomenon arising from smaller things, the ants. Well, in the same way, we've already talking about cells as a complex system. So if you go into the microscopic level, or like I do into human tissues when I'm looking at biopsy specimens all day long, because that's what pays my bills, and I like doing it, the ant body itself disappears and now appears to be a phenomenon arising from smaller things, the process of how cells are interacting with each other. So you see, if you've never seen a murmuration of starlings and you hear this sound, I remember the first time I ever saw it, it was in Rome, and there's this sound, and I look up and I thought, what's that ship? And then I realized, oh, it's a flock of birds. In the same way, you go into one of these starlings and go in close enough, the starling disappears and it's a flock of cells. And so whether something appears to be a thing or a phenomenon arising from smaller things depends on the scale of observation. And we refer to this as complementarity. It's exactly like Bohr's use of complementarity in quantum physics for the wave particle duality of light. Depending on how you design the experiment, you will see light as waves or as particles, but you can't see it as both. And one isn't favored. They are exactly equivalent, 50-50. The image I like to use is this, the two faces looking at each other in silhouette, and the space between them looking like a vase. Is it two faces? Then you miss the vase. Is it a vase? Then you're not seeing the faces. You need both to have a full understanding, but you can only see half of it at any one time. This is another complementarity. So whether my body is a thing like this, and if we were in a room together, we'd be bounded by our skin, and we'd be two separate things in the room. But at the cellular level, there are no bodies there. And in fact, because of the microbiome, you're leaving, if we shake hands or hug, we're going to exchange microbiome. And within a few days, people in a household, their cells are forming a single cloud of microbiome around them and their pets. Where are your boundaries? These are complementarities. Another way to diagram this is cells self-organize into bodies. And as I've said, depending on what you define as a body, you get different types of communities, cities, cultures, ecosystems, Gaia as a living organism. So are cells a fundamental thing? Obviously not. And this is an issue for Western medicine, Western biology. What we mean by Western is that when we looked under the microscope and could see that cells, that tissues were made of cells that had membranes, it looked like an empty room and sort of like the cell of a monk or the cell of a prisoner. That's why the word cell. And if you chop that into pieces, you don't get smaller cells. What you get is fragments. And so with the microscope, we thought, oh, living things are made of cells, and that's what defines a body. And all cells come from pre-existing cells. From a complexity standpoint, no. You go down to the nanoscopic level, the cell ceases to exist as a thing. The body is just molecules floating in aqueous solution. And if it weren't for body temperature giving you just the right amount of jostling, just the right amount of randomness, they wouldn't self-organize into cells or the physiology of your body. And where are your boundaries when we're at the molecular level? I'm breathing out carbon dioxide. The plants are breathing out, taking it in and breathing out oxygen for me. There's uncountable numbers of exchanges like that. At the molecular level, there is no separation between our bodies and the entire biomass of the planet. You go down to so this becomes an issue of boundaries. Boundaries are scale perspective. And this is the home stretch for what I want to show you didactically. At this level of scale, our boundary is our skin. At the cellular level of scale, we're shedding microbiome and our cells into the environment. So our boundaries are the spaces we occupy during the day. At the molecular level, it's the entire biomass of the planet. These are complementarities too. Are molecules fundamental? No, of course not. They're self-organizing atoms. Well, what are our boundaries at the atomic level? There's no atom in our bodies that we didn't eat, drink, or breathe from the planet. So are we lonely, anxious creatures wandering around on the top of this rock we call planet Earth? Or Are we the atomic substance of the planet that over 3.5 billion years has self-organized itself into creatures that are mistakenly thinking they're separate? Essentially, we're walking, talking Earth. And at the atomic level, our boundaries are the entire planet. This is the Gaia hypothesis. And it's not just the living stuff of the planet, but the organic and inorganic aspects. And then below that, it's just subatomic particles. We're in the quantum realm, and we know, without going into too much details, we don't know what the smallest things are. Might be strings, might be other kinds of particles or whatever. But it's not an infinite regress to smaller and smaller things. We get down to what's called the quantum foam. And here in the quantum realm, there's non-locality, there's entanglement. There are no boundaries. At the quantum level, what are our boundaries? The entire universe. And we are the universe just within itself. And these things just are emanated out of space-time, because quantum physics tells us space-time is an energy-rich field. It's not empty. It's not a vacuum. And thanks to relativity equals mc squared, it's an energy-rich field that inevitably E equals mc squared gives rise to whatever those smallest things are. And they tend to self-annihilate in matter-antimatter pairings. But if they don't, they interact with each other to become subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, the whole universe. So the universe is a complex system. There is no thing anywhere. And where this gets you is the idea of the universe itself is a boundless body, of which are all differentiated pieces within it. The universe is not an empty box. It's not a location in which our lives take place. We are the universe, which within itself gives rise to expressions that we think of as being separate and isolated. And this obviously has spiritual implications, and this is something I go into a lot in the book. Buddhism, emptiness of inherent existence, that's complementarity, interdependence, impermanence, karmic law, all of this comes right out of complexity theory. And in the book, I also explore these other fields. And all of this, so where I end in one part of the book is this, and maybe this is a good place to stop. A complexity understanding of the universe reveals unequivocally, unavoidably, that however separate and alone we might feel, each one of us is, in each and every single moment, a pure expression of the entire universe. Nothing separate, nothing left out, but true, pure, and complete, just as we are.
So beautiful.
And that's just part one.
Neil, thank
And
you.
there's consciousness, but
And we have
maybe for some other time.
maybe, yeah, maybe we can touch on it in the few minutes that we have. Thank you for that overview. So beautiful, kind of getting us oriented to the nature of our complex universe and us a part of it, an embodiment of it in essence.
Yeah, yeah.
So much beauty to unpack here and to consider as we walk through our day and even walk in the world and walk with each other. And of course, its relevance to consciousness and healing and our own practice is a wonderful place to also begin our self-inquiry into this. And many of us on this webinar and listening in are practitioners, have our own practice, whether we practice with ourselves, we practice with others. As you know, many healing practitioners talk about accessing the 0 point quantum field in their healing. They understand that healing can happen, through these principles, perhaps of complementarity. They may not use the same language necessarily for it, but the phenomena that they experience is very aligned with what you're describing here. Want to
So,
want to encourage people. Have a few people putting in questions in the chat. If you do have a question for Neil, we do have a few minutes, and I will help facilitate your question with him. Here's a question that someone has. I'm going to see if I can decipher the question here. Early interdependent in its complexity. Can you comment on that? So maybe the question has to do with the relationship of interdependence with complexity.
to some extent, that's everything's local, not global. The nature of how a system self-organizes comes about because of how each member of the system is interacting. with every other member of the system. So there's no ant that's unimportant. There's no person that's unimportant. Indra's web in Buddhist terms, everything impacts and affects everything else through the network of interactions. Nothing can be separate, in fact, from anything else. However much the instincts we're raised within our culture say that, oh, we're all in our separate boxes. That's not true. So to me, that's what I mean by interdependence. It's that everything is happening through local interactions, and every element interacts in some way with every other element.
So then would you say, given that the interdependence factor and the emphasis here on local interactions,
Mm-hmm.
that if we take this to the social level, let's go ahead and do that for a moment, then would it be safe to say that the environment that you find yourself in, the personal interactions, the nature interactions, with living organic and inorganic systems, as you call them, essentially constrain the adjacent possibilities? If you want to,
Mm-hmm.
constrain is a funny word, but for
No,
lack
no,
of,
no.
they kind of shape, if you will,
Right.
the adjacent possibles, right? So
Of
this is.
course, the negative feedback loops.
Mhm,
Life is a constrained system.
mhm,
If it weren't, there'd be no self-organization.
mhm.
Um, it requires, and all living things oscillate. If you find something that's absolutely stable, it's not alive, it's dead, right? So yeah, I think that's where rule number 2 comes into play. In complexity language, the constraints that allow for the adjacent possibles, that's the homeostatic feedback loops that keep you in balance.
And related to this, a question, again, these questions, some are kind of easily formed questions, some are not. I'll just read this one
Mhm.
out, and we can kind of decipher what they're asking, but I think we can relate it to what we're talking about right here. W. Tucker is asking, just had an ASIM course reading this morning, ego versus separation of love God was the discussion. Discuss. So in that, I think I understand where this person is wanting to go. If we think about adjacent possibles and understanding that consciousness, our relationship with consciousness, our ability to, for lack of a better term, again, language is limiting, expand consciousness, feel into the oneness, also has an influence on adjacent possibles. And I think about this with relationship to the healing work as well. When we think about what our biofield healing, spiritual healing practitioners, energy healing, whatever we want to call them, the experience of kind of coming into embodiment, being centered, grounded, but connected with a broader whole, soul,
Mhm.
spirit, God, universal life energy, ancestors, guides, right?
Mhm.
There is a process of both deepening and opening that is taking place, where perhaps we're allowing for more information to be utilized, felt, sensed
Mhm.
in the
So
healing process.
yeah, yeah. So I'm going to share screen just to put up one other image. Um, and as I do that, I'm going to say that the importance of, to me, of oh, can I do this easily? Maybe not. All right, no, I'm not going to bother trying. Um, so first of all, if I come into a room as a physician, I can come into the room and think of myself at this level of scale as being separate. If I come into a room as some sort of energy practitioner, well, whatever we mean by energy, we're probably talking about the quantum level, whether it's electromagnetic or thermal or whatever. And at that level of scale, when I enter the room, I'm not a separate person coming in to help a client. I'm a field of that energy within which I'm working, which is already merged as a single field that intensifies as I come closer to the person who's waiting for me in that room. There is no separation. Now, if I'm an orthopedist and the person in that room has a broken bone, the question is, how do I put a splint on?
Mhm.
Skillful means there is to work at this level of scale. And the energy field is nice, but the first thing is get a splint.
Mhm.
But if the person has issues with fatigue and is dispirited and any number of things that I've experienced in the last year of all sorts of stuff going on, um, then the location for my attention becomes the bodies that are not separate, but are intermingled. The image I was going to bring up is where I actually go in the second half of the book, is that consciousness is not arising from the universe at any level of scale. Our brain does not make our mind. That's the materialist view. The universe does not make our mind. That's the panpsychist view, and there are various versions of it. The third possibility is that mind is what underlies everything, and it's pure fundamental non-dual awareness. As it becomes aware of itself because it's curious to get to know itself, gives rise to what we experience as material existence. So in which case, so that's underneath that stacked image I have. Underneath that is the actual ground of being, which is pure fundamental non-dual awareness. And the second half of the book is my argument for that being the case. And if that's the case, then yeah, when you enter that room to take care of your child who's had a nightmare, or your spouse who's worried about, that's going to get me choked up. That's the ground out of which all activity is going to happen, from which all process, all healing is going to happen. How important is it to be there? Well, if I'm resting in that kind of non-dual awareness because I'm really deep in meditation, I'm not going to be able to splint that broken arm. My mom, in her later years, she lost her short-term memory. And in her words, I said, "Why are you smiling all the time? You even smile when you're sleeping," which is not who she was typically when I was growing up. And she said, "Well, I no longer worry about the future and I can't remember the past. So all I have is the now. And when you look at the now, you're happy." So, but she needed 24-hour home care because in that state, she could not feed herself. So what's the skillful healing? Where's the skillful place to put your attention, or the places to put your attention and work flexibly between them? To me, one of the major points of all this is it's not knowing that everything is one or knowing that everything is a building block in the machine. It's how do you move flexibly between all these views, which are complementary to each other, and use your intuition to understand what's needed right in front of me now by my child who had a nightmare, or the patient in the room with a broken arm, or, etc.
And here's the dance of complexity. I keep thinking of that graphic you showed of that border between, so-called order and chaos. So again, witnessing all of it,
Yeah.
being the witness and witnessing all of it. And as you say, having the fluidity to move at different levels of scale. And I feel that this is very relevant in today's times when we have so many inputs. We have a lot of negativity socially, sociopolitically. We have climate change. We have real issues that are taking place that are shifting everything. As you said, everything is impermanent. We have these feed forward systems that have been going on for a while. So we're seeing the backlashes, literally, the feedback systems trying to re-regulate in this way. And so we really have to remain witness to that while at the same time not getting constrained in, what could be predictable adjacent possibles.
Right.
Right. So it's a very interesting time to be in human form right now,
Yeah.
dealing with all of these things. And and then there are the typical social pressures dealing with one's own mortality and all those things. So for many, it may feel like a heavy time. And yet, what I feel is your lessons here on complexity are reminding us that we're still very much in a very deeply informational rich system, and a
And
slightly
anything can happen.
exactly. It's not
Anything can happen.
predictable, no matter what everyone tells us.
Right. And you don't know, no matter how smart you are, and you think you're planning really hard to have the right intervention, but you don't know if the intervention that changes the whole cloud of adjacent possibles from this to this is how you said good morning to that person.
Mm-hmm.
Or the person you walk by every day who's busy with their stuff and they have nothing to do with you, and you don't know what little interaction they have that propagates like the butterfly wings flapping into something that shifts society. All you can do is bear witness to what's in front of you, do what you can, give up any hope or expectation that you'll know whether it was something you did, um, and give it a try. And you may or may not live to see the outcome. Do we have time for a very, very, very poignant but very important story?
I would love that.
I found my father was born in Germany, Jewish, 1930s, not a good time. He was sent to England on the Kindertransport. That's how he survived. His older brother was too old to be sent to England and wound up being shipped to Riga, which is where the German Jews were largely killed. And my grandmother had the chance to send him to the Netherlands, but couldn't bear to send her other son. And I found when I went to Riga a few years ago, I actually managed to find where she was killed in the forest. And I felt in the moment like I knew who she was and what she died with, which was we made all the wrong choices. And the result is I've lost everything. What she couldn't know, but I could know, is that of all her siblings and all her cousins, she was the only one that did not lose a child. She saved my father, and because my uncle was not sent to Amsterdam, he went to a work camp, which gave him the opportunity to survive. Otherwise, he would have been in a concentration camp, and that would have been it. Wow. Both her children survived, and I think there's now 35 descendants.
Wow.
So you have to, all you can do is do your best in that moment. And you can't live for the idea that you will know whether you chose right or whether it was your gesture that made the difference. All you can do is know that any gesture could make the difference. And so in this moment, do the best that you possibly can. Show up and be present, be aware, bear witness to what's in front of you, and respond like you're speaking about from within. And, to me, it doesn't tell us how we're going to fix things, but it helps me think about how to get through day by day, given everything we're facing, and not completely despair or give up. So I keep coming back to her as like, oh, she did everything right, but she didn't even know it.
She
but
didn't even
that's
know
okay
it.
too.
Yeah. But she created these adjacent possibles that made
that
all
allowed all this to happen. Everything, we all survived. There are a lot of us, and I brought this up to everyone's awareness, and like the whole family is really clear. There's a ghost story that goes with this, but I'll leave that for some other time.
Wow, Neil, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that personal story, because sometimes we forget how relevant these
These are
principles
such
are to our
abstract
own
things.
lives. They may seem,
Yeah.
but they're not. And for me, when I read books like yours and I ponder these realities of what science is telling us about the nature of ourselves and our universe, and that the fact that we are the universe, really.
Right.
As you know, we didn't get a chance to touch on it. I think we should do a part two where we really explore these relationships of consciousness and the different ways that indigenous and spiritual traditions have viewed it, and the relationships of what we've been finding or you've been finding with complexity theory.
Yeah.
We didn't even touch on the interstitium. Yeah, I'm getting a lot of messages here in the chat. Bring Neil back. We will do it. We will
Can I give
definitely.
a shout out? A
Yes.
quick shout out. Jen Brandell is in the audience, who's the reporter on my interstitium program on Radiolab.
Oh,
If you
great.
haven't seen our Radiolab thing on the interstitium, you don't need me to talk about it. Just go listen to Jen.
Oh, great. Yeah, maybe we
Yeah.
can share that as a follow-up resource
Oh,
for
yeah. That's a great idea. I'll send that link for you. Yeah.
that'd be great. Well, Neil, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your heart, your presence. With everything going on in the world, lights like you to shed light on the nature of our reality keeps us inspired, keeps us excited for what science holds in store for us, the nature of consciousness and healing. We're so deeply, deeply grateful for your work. Thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, thank you so much for joining in, being part of this beautiful conversation. May your day be ever rich and complex, full of information and full of light as you move through your weekend. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Shamini and team.